Welcome to episode 325 of the Merry Podcasters. I'm your host, Alex. As many of you know, I've been away a long time. With me today is my good friend Bill T.
Thanks, Alex. I'm happy to be on here. What's the plan today?
So today we're going to be talking about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and how it connects to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey.
I love history. It's like a story, but it really did happen.
Let's get some baseline knowledge on the topic. What do you know about the Pueblo Revolt, Bill?
Well, I know it was in the 17th century, and it was in New Mexico. A guy named Pope led a successful revolt against the Spanish colony established there and secured land for the native people. But I also know that for some reason he was deposed and then died shortly after.
Yeah, you're right. The rebellion was in 1680, but our story begins in the 16th century, when a Spaniard named Juan Oñate slaughtered a large number of native Pueblo Indians to put down a revolt. After Spanish law required the humane treatment of Indians, things calmed down. But in 1670, a famine spread and a small Pueblo uprising began. After some Pueblo medicinal healers were put in prison, local leaders came to break them out. One of the men freed was named Pope. For the next few years, Pope mustered forces across cities and campaigned for a free Pueblo society. After leading a successful revolt, Pope had secured the land in New Mexico for the Puebloans. Unfortunately, after his initial victory, distrust of Pope began to manifest in the local Pueblo population. Thereafter, he was deposed. He actually did get reelected, but then died shortly after.
Whoa, that sounds like quite a story. I actually heard about how the Pueblo Revolt was super important because it was one of the first times a non-unified group of natives beat back the Europeans. I also know that the Spanish actually tried to reconquer that area 3 times after Pope, but couldn't do it.
That's right. The Pueblo Revolt was the largest Native American rebellion in North American history. Decades later, after Pope's death, the natives did eventually lose. However, Pope's revolt successfully preserved Puebloan traditions from being driven to extinction like so many other native cultures. The occupation of Pueblo lands afterwards saw Puebloans granted special religious tolerance and autocracy. Today, for their efforts to maintain independence, Pueblo Indians have been granted land in the U.S. and still practice their original religion in their homeland.
But what I'm really interested in is the Spanish occupation. What did they do that made it so bad that Pope could muster this kind of rebellion?
Well, it's pretty bad. Spanish occupation saw thousands of natives put to work due to a need for labor. Aside from just slavery, the natives were introduced into the Spanish culture. Basically, they were religiously indoctrinated, which was often forced.
Why couldn't they just rebel like they did with Pope?
I would say that it was like rule with an iron fist. I mean, when you're outmanned and outgunned, it's hard to mount a successful revolt. Just look at what happened with the Spanish. They killed hundreds of natives just to keep control. If I was a native, I would just cave in and I would follow the rules and shut up.
Originally what you were talking about was kinda foggy, but I'm seeing some connections now. You're trying to say this is the Combine, right? Like how the patients were forced to follow the rules or else face serious punishment? The Spanish way of indoctrinating people into their religion was like how Nurse Ratched enforced her control over the patients. I guess EST is like the labor they were sentenced to, and the Pueblo Revolt is just like McMurphy's rebellion against Nurse Ratched.
Precisely, and the Pueblo land is similar to the ward. It was where the conflict took place. The Puebloan people are like the patients in the ward because they're all being controlled by a more powerful figure. You know, Nurse Ratched and the Spanish Empire. So the way the Spanish controlled the native population is like the Combine because it all ran like a well-oiled machine. They exploited the locals for labor and destroyed their culture to get rid of dissent. But there's a little bit more. A lot of the characters in the story are like people in history. Can you guess?
Well, I'll take a shot. Is Pope McMurphy?
Alright, well I'll give you that. But I think we need some more expertise. Let's call in some of my friends.
Here we go. First is Dr. Wang. Hi, Dr. Wang.
Hello, Bill and Alex. What do you need me for?
Well, Alex and I are here to talk about the Pueblo Revolt, and we were thinking that a lot of it resembles One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Well, as a professor of history, I know a lot about the Pueblo Revolt. Regarding Cuckoo's Nest, I remember some teacher from high school made me read it, and I'm pretty sure I might have read it past 1 a.m. the night before the test. so my memory isn't perfect, but if I remember, there was this mean old lady called Nurse Ratched who did horrible things to the patients.
Yeah, she was the antagonist. Was there anyone like that in the Pueblo Revolt?
Yeah, Juan de Oñate was the leader of the Spanish, who put down all resistance to Spanish rule using fear tactics. The prime example of his power was shown in the Acoma massacre. Oñate wanted to teach the Pueblo Indians what would happen if they didn't follow the rules, so he killed over 800 Indians and cut a foot off every single male over 25 years old. After this, all the Indians were scared stiff and were afraid to act against the Spanish authority. Sounds just like Nurse Ratched, no?
Yeah, Nurse Ratched destroyed the confidence and the strength of all the patients, made them feel really weak and powerless.
Interestingly enough, Oñate thought that he was fixing the Indians and bringing them a better lifestyle, just as Nurse Ratched thought she was fixing the patients in the ward for the Combine, and obviously that wasn't the case. Indians were enslaved, restricted access to farmlands, water supply, and even their own religion. And anyone who stepped out of line was killed, just like how Ratched would send people to the disturbed ward.
So, the Pueblo Revolt, how does that play into the idea of Nurse Ratched?
So the Puebloans revolted and destroyed Spanish establishments and killed 400 Spanish, forcing them out, not unlike how McMurphy attacked Nurse Ratched and forced her to leave for a while. But remember that when Nurse Ratched returned, she couldn't talk and had lost a lot of her power. And just like that, when the Spanish returned, this time led by Diego de Vargas, they were also unable to restore full Spanish authority. Pueblo Indians were able to fight to keep their land, religious practices, and even appointed a public defender to protect the rights of the Indians in Spanish courts.
Alright, thank you, Mr. Wang.
Honey, it's Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, for your details of the Pueblo Revolt and its connection to Nurse Ratched. I'm sure the information is very historically accurate.
Alright, and now we're on to our second guest, Dr. Kashner. Hi, Professor Kashner. We were just discussing Mr. Oñate and Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, really? I happen to teach a course in New Mexico State history at UNM. Oñate certainly left his mark on the Pueblo people of New Mexico. However, I'm partial to another figure who made an impact during the 17th century.
Would that happen to be a man named Pope?
It certainly would be. He grew up on the Tewa Pueblo, and his role in the Pueblo Revolt brought peace to his people. It was a remarkable turn of events for the Puebloans.
So, what influenced him to be such a powerhouse?
Well, he believed that the Kachinas commanded him to restore the natives' traditions. Faith allowed him to go above and beyond.
Just like McMurphy, without the religious faith part, of course.
Yes, but McMurphy had faith in other things, most notably himself. McMurphy was the one who came into the ward and started changing the standard operating procedures. He was the one to speak up and speak out against Nurse Ratched. As we know, she was the ward's suppressor. Unfortunately, both McMurphy and Pope suffered the consequences of their popularity and increasing power.
So we were discussing this earlier, but what happened?
After a few years, Pope was deposed due to drought, enemy tribe forays, and numerous disputes. Luckily, he wasn't forgotten for long. He was re-elected in 1688, just 4 years before his death. Doesn't McMurphy's removal from power seem similar to Pope's?
Yeah, it does. I hadn't thought of that before. McMurphy got taken to electroshock therapy in disturbed ward, and while he was there, the patients downstairs continued and even increased their support towards him, right?
Yes, exactly. Bringing him back is parallel to Pope's re-election.
After his re-election, something important happened as a result of Pope's legacy, right?
Yes, the Pueblos were granted more freedoms as a result of Pope's leadership. When Diego de Vargas reconquered the area for Spain, the goal was to create a barrier between French territory and Mexico. The Pueblos would no longer be subjected to the intense missionary efforts of the Franciscans left in the area. Pope had succeeded in preserving the culture of the Puebloans and beating back the Spanish influence. He encouraged the practices of Pueblo religion and the use of the Pueblo language as opposed to the opposite under Spanish control.
That's similar to McMurphy in that he altered the environment of the ward permanently. He taught the patients to stick up for themselves and showed the big nurse that she does not have as much power as she seems to think.
While both McMurphy and Pope died before the end of their respective battles, they left a lasting impression on their communities.
Thanks, Dr. Kashner. And now we're going to have the interview with our final guest.
Hello, is this thing on?
Yeah, hey guys, what's up?
Well, we're calling some experts on how the Pueblo Revolt is similar to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I know that you know your history. Could you give us some help?
Yeah, I'll give you some of my insight. I think that Brandon is similar to Juan El Taño, leader of the Galisteo tribe near the Pueblos. He was the tribe leader for many years, but only took up arms against the Spanish control when Pope started his rebellion. During the revolt, he became a major general of Pope's army and fought in many battles.
I see. That's what Bromden did in the war. He had been in there for years but never had the courage to go against the Combine. When McMurphy comes into the ward, however, he starts to become his old self again, and then he eventually fights the orderlies and also breaks out.
Exactly. You know, Brandon is a Native American chief, just like El Taño. I think of him as Brandon symbolically too, because before any changes happened, he was passive and sat under Spain's control until McMurphy's figure showed up. That's Pope. After Pope started his rebellion, Taño had the courage to stand up for himself and his people. That's what you were talking about, right? Brandon had stayed in the ward, following the rules while his personality was being stripped away until he became mute. I think of him as being similar to how Spain stripped away native traditions over time.
That's really interesting. Bill and I were actually just talking about that before we called you. The Spanish would strip away cultural traditions, especially the Pueblo religion.
So Taño, along with the other chiefs, was doing the same thing as Brandon, where they just caved in the Spanish Empire and allowed themselves to become integrated into the Spanish exploitation of America.
Thanks for your advice, Ian.
No problem, guys. I'm happy to help.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 325 of the Merry Podcasters. And make sure to tune in to the next time we release our episode, where we'll be talking about boomers.